Hey guys, welcome back to History of Modern Medicine, History 417. First of all, congratulations, you did it. You made it through the first at least 2 days of the semester. I'm recording this on Tuesday night. I'm not sure, depending on when you watch it, maybe you've made it through almost the whole week. Yay, we did it. Congrats to those of you who survived a fully online first 2 days. Congrats to those of you who figured out how to find an in-person class and how to navigate the social Tetris of moving yourself around in a room with other people, making sure to try to stay as far away from them as possible. But however you spent the last 2 days, we all survived. We're here. You're here watching this incredibly interesting, I know, video that I'm about to produce, and we all deserve an extra slice of dessert, I think, for that. Also, not only is this the first week of the fall semester of 2020, it's also the week that brought us fire tornadoes, because 2020 didn't have enough to offer us already. Do you ever get nostalgic for those murder hornets? Remember when we thought that was going to be like the worst thing? Okay, enough chip chat. Let's get down to business. This video is called How to Do History. Let me go ahead and open my slides so that you can see what I've made for you, and you don't have to keep looking at me. First of all, if you're worried about how this is going to be, watching 2 videos of me a week, don't worry. This is the only week where you have to watch me twice. Every other week, it's just that first video. So you can do this. I'm gonna try to make this one short too. Hopefully it's not gonna be as long as the one earlier this week. Okay, so this is called How to Do History. What I wanna do at the very beginning, I try to do this in all my history classes because I know that at least half, if not more, of the students who take my courses are not history majors. Maybe this is the first history class you've taken since high school, and that's fine. I don't make these classes in any way assuming that you have historical knowledge or you have his background of doing history. So what I do is I put this up at the beginning. How do I want you to be thinking about the ways in which historians do history and the ways that you are going to be doing history in this class? Because in this class, you're all historians, at least for 16 weeks. You can go back to being whatever else you want to be at the end of the semester, but when you're mine, you're a historian. Okay, mostly what I'm going to talk about today are what do historians use to make history, and what kind of history do we make with those things that we use to make history? Sound good? Okay, let's start with a sort of graphical representation of sort of how I think of how history is made. So starting at the bottom, this is basically stuff happened, right? Stuff happened in the past. Someone got run over by a horse cart. Someone died in a battle. Someone slept with her neighbor's husband, right? Stuff happened in the past. And the reason I make this into a triangle is because it's sort of, as we go up the triangle, we know less about that stuff, okay? But stuff happened. Now, how do we know about stuff? Well, we only know that stuff happened in the past by the remnants that people leave behind about that stuff, right? And these remnants are anything. They could be a document, they could be a piece of clothing, they could be a piece of art, right? The sort of physical, tangible things people leave behind that we pick up and we try to interpret and figure out what happened in the past. And that stuff that people leave behind, those artifacts, those remnants, we call those primary sources, right? Those are the things that give us the best clue about what happened in the past. Now, notice we've already sort of gotten smaller in terms of the amount of knowledge we have about stuff happened, because not all the stuff that people make or create or write down when the stuff is happening survives long enough for historians to pick it up and find it. But also, right, most of us don't go around recording every single thing that happened to us during the day, or every single thing we thought about that crazy thing that happened to us today. I mean, one of the things actually I was trying to push my students to do in the spring semester was start keeping a pandemic journal, right? Historians are going to love, even if it seems like really mundane thoughts or things that are going to become normal potentially in the years following the pandemic, write down anything that seems strange or unusual, because as a historian, I want the historians 100 years from now to be able to pick up the journal of a college student who was living through 2020 and just talking about how weird it was to go to the grocery store in March of 2020. Anyways, so primary sources, less knowledge, but these are our best link to the stuff that happened. Now, Going farther up, this is where we get history, right? History is the sort of utilization of those primary sources, of those remnants, of the artifacts, of the coats, of the horse carts, of the sculptures, of the personal letters, all that stuff, and trying to create meaning from those sources. And as you can see, we're getting even sort of smaller in the amount of knowledge that we have about that stuff that happened as we go up. Now, the top of the pyramid is something that we don't actually need to worry about in this class. If you're a history major, you might end up taking an entire class about it, but this is called historiography. Historiography is sort of when historians get together and they decide what's the best way to do that history? What's the best methodology for interpreting sources? And how have people done history in the past? And how can we learn from that? And how can we maybe do history a little bit different today? Those are the sort of discussions that create historiography. But instead, what we're going to talk about is sort of stuff happened, what sources are left behind, and as historians, how do we make sense of those primary sources? Okay, so here's just sort of, again, a visual representation of how primary sources can be a range of things, right? They can be a newspaper article, a personal letter, a billboard or a poster, a tapestry, a coin. All of this stuff counts as primary sources, right? It's that, again, that tangible stuff that's left behind by the people who lived in the past. Okay, so we've already sort of said primary sources are written evidence or artifacts that offer information about the past. For purposes of this course, we are almost exclusively, I have to double check, I'm not going to say only dealing with written evidence. I'm trying to remember, I might be showing you some images of other types of artifacts, but mostly we're going to be dealing with written evidence, so textual things as primary sources throughout this course, okay? And historians utilize primary sources to generate stories and meanings of the past, right? So that historians take sometimes just one source. Usually we try to get as many types of sources around whatever the topic is that we're trying to create a story and fit them all together into some sort of usable meaning. But one thing to note is that history is an interpretation of primary sources, and that interpretation can change with perspective. History is not a study of facts. There are no historical facts because we don't know what happened in the historical time period. Even if we had sort of one person's for sure and we believe them 100% account of something that happened, that's one person's viewpoint. That doesn't mean that that's for sure the way it happened, right? You might have someone who is the exact same event or sort of phenomenon and describes it differently. All we can do as historians is take those primary sources and make an interpretation, make a very, I was going to say educated guess. It's a little bit better than an educated guess, but not by much, right? What we're doing is using, little scraps of evidence that are left behind by people who lived in the past and piecing them together like a puzzle into a meaningful story. However, that interpretation, that puzzle piecing, is going to change depending on the perspective of the historian. Now, sometimes, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on in this talk, sometimes the perspective is time, right? So a historian could pick up a primary source in 1965 and interpret it one way. A historian could pick up a source, that's exact same source in 2020 and interpret it very differently. But perspective is not just sort of when that primary source is interpreted by the historian, but also the perspective of the historian in terms of things like gender, race, personal experience, educational background, right? There's lots of things that make up us as historians that we bring to our interpretation of history. And so even today, right, in 2020, I could give two historians the exact same source, and they might pick out different things about it and interpret in different ways. And part of the history profession, right, is a bunch of historians and sort of getting together and bouncing this off of each other. Like someone saying, I read this word to mean kind of this. And another historian saying, I like your idea, but I was kind of thinking it was maybe like this, right? It's much more of a collaboration, history is, than we tend to think of. I think too often, especially sort of in popular media, you think of history as sort of, usually a white man, right, finding a book, reading it and saying, aha, I've discovered the truth about Newton. Bullshit. Okay, so that's what primary sources are. Now, you're gonna look at a lot of primary sources, we're gonna look at a fair number of primary sources in this course. And what I want you to start thinking about is what is the information you need to glean from that primary source and how do you use it to start to create stories and meaning. So the first thing I want you to is just sort of notice some very sort of basic stuff about these primary sources. So you're going to be doing this very explicitly in that first assignment that you have, where you fill out a primary source worksheet based on primary source and then write a paper. But you're also going to be doing this with some of the course readings, because some of your course readings are primary sources. So the first thing I want you to do, and if it's a course reading, do this. If you're printing out your reading, write it right on there, circle it, although I know nobody's going to be printing out the readings except me. Okay, so somewhere in your computer, in some high-tech, fangled way that you can do it, right? Circle it, put it in your notes, put this stuff somewhere very clearly so it's easily found, okay? And that is the first thing, the date. It's extremely important to know the date of a primary source, because the sort of meaning in the story that you're going to create based on this primary source only works for the date in which it was created, right? If I have a letter written by Abigail Adams about how she's feeling about her husband in 1782, that doesn't tell me actually anything about how she was feeling about her husband in 1762 or in 1792, right? All I can say is that, well, on this date, she was not feeling that jazzed about John Adams. You don't have to know those names, although maybe you should. Author, who wrote it? And here I don't really mean names. Sometimes the name can help you, but usually if there is a name, it's meaningless to us. And very often there's not a name. Instead, I want you to be able to sort of figure if there's anything we can figure out based on where this writing appears, or sort of how the person talks about themselves in the source. Things like the author's gender, the author's race, the author's class, the author's profession. This is going to come up a lot actually in our discussions throughout the semester, sort of how people within the medical profession and how people outside of the medical profession are going to be looking at issues differently, right? Because someone inside the medical profession is going to be interested in doing things like supporting the profession, promoting the profession, whereas we're more likely to get critiques of the profession by people outside of the profession. So whenever you are dealing with a primary source, try to figure out as much of that kind of stuff as possible. There are going to be some primary sources where you're like, I have no idea who wrote this. Nobody's given me any clues. The writing doesn't give me any clues, and that'll happen, right? But as much of that as you can sort of understand from the primary source, again, gender, race, class, profession. There's probably more things that I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but they'll come up on your primary source worksheet if there's other things I want you to think about in terms of the author. Okay, publication. Where did this piece of documentation originally show up, right? Was this something that was written for a newspaper? Was this something written for a medical journal? Was this something written as personal correspondence between two physicians? Was this something that was an advertisement that would show up maybe on the side of a general store, right? How much do we know, and what do we know about where this originally showed up? Okay, so figure that out if you can on your primary source and make note of it. And finally, basic content. So what is the sort of just general who, what, where, when, why, or general message that is being conveyed by this source? What's the basic story if you had to sort of distill it into 2 or 3 bullet points, okay? So that's the first thing that you're going to sort of take note of and write down about a primary source. And this is the stuff I call surface layers. But this is only the very beginning of understanding a primary source and trying to figure out sort of how you can determine the meaning and the story in which this primary source fits. It's a lot harder, and I'm going to push you to do this multiple times throughout the semester, but a lot more rewarding to think about sort of underneath the surface. What can we pull out of this primary source that is not necessarily the sort of surface details? And so here are some things to keep in mind to look deeper at primary sources. One of them is tone. Was this source written in an informal chatty tone? Was this source written in a formal tone? Was this source written in a combative tone where someone seems to be arguing something? Is this written in sort of official tone where it's sort of the author wants to, wants to sort of present an objective viewpoint? What's the tone of this source? Language. Language is so important in a primary source and can give you so many clues. And language is one of those things that you could spend so much time on really almost every single word in a primary source and discover something new about it or have sort of new thoughts about what it might mean. I'm not going to make you go through every single word of your primary sources, but I am going to make you, we're going to have a couple examples in class, and then through your primary source assignments, I am going to make you pick out a couple words and tell me why you think the author chose that word. One of the things I want you to keep in mind throughout all of your readings and analysis of primary sources is that an author and a creator of a primary source was making very deliberate choices about everything about it, about the tone, about the language, about the presentation. So why did the author pick that word? When it comes to medical writings, one of the things I want you to keep an eye out for is how healers, maybe a doctor, maybe a midwife, whoever reading, describe their patient. What clues or sort of what physical descriptors, what other sort of descriptors are they including about the patient? Because that's going to tell us about what we think, about what that practitioner deemed as valuable information in determining someone's status of health or illness. Okay, so we'll get to that. Okay, audience. Who do we think this was written for? Sometimes it'll be somewhat clear if we know the publication and we have sort of an understanding, right? A newspaper, even that though is not super easy, right? You could say, okay, newspaper is just written for the public of that local town, right? Albuquerque Journal is written for people of Albuquerque. Is it really? Especially individual newspaper articles are often intended for particular audiences, maybe particular political audiences, but trying to determine who you think the author is really wanting to speak to can really help you understand why they created the story and what they're thinking about this issue. And finally, purpose. And again, this is sort of, you could read this at a surface level and say, oh, well, the purpose of this is just to disseminate information. That's rarely the case, that anyone has that sort of very simplistic purpose of anything. Because most people don't go around spouting everything they know because they want to disseminate information, right? Especially someone like a physician. A physician is going to choose particular cases, particular phenomena to publish for particular purposes. They don't write about every patient they ever see. They pick particular ones. And so one of our jobs is to figure out, okay, why? Why did they pick this particular case to publish in a medical journal? What did they think is the purpose of telling others in their profession about this phenomena that they are describing? Okay, and this I'm calling the underlayer. I feel like there's a better word for it than underlayer, especially because now I'm saying it sounds like underwear, but let's stick with it for now. Something else might come to me. Okay, so this is how I want you to be looking at a primary source. Now, there's another type of source that you're gonna be dealing with this course at this point, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because we're going to talk a little bit more next week when you have your first of these kind of sources, and that's called a secondary source. So a secondary source is a journal article written by a historian. It's a historical book. It's a, what's this called? A documentary, sorry, a podcast. So articles, books, podcasts, blog posts, documentaries that use primary sources to create a story and or argument. So this is what historians make, is secondary sources, right? So they collect a bunch of primary sources, they fit them together in some sort of meaningful puzzle, and then they produce a secondary source to share that meaning, that story, that argument with other people. Historians interpret primary sources based on both historical context and current context, right? So this is going back to that idea of perspective of the historian. So when the current context changes, interpretations of primary sources can change. And actually, we want interpretations to change. Let me give you a couple examples to sort of point this out. So another way to sort of say this is that we would expect, right, a historian picking up a source, again in 1965, to make a different interpretation of a primary source than someone picking up in 2020. So for example, I know you can't really see the text, I'm going to read you the text, but this is an image that is out of a book that, to the best of my knowledge, I haven't been able to sort of totally pin down where this comes from. This was published sometime in the 1980s. And I know the image is not very good, so I did find one other depiction of the image. So this is the image that this historian is interpreting. And what is said about this image. This image is used in at least 2 17th century ballads. There's no clue as to what these 2 women in bed together are doing. The image might represent a mistress and servant, or 2 friends sharing a bed, as many did away from home. For a long time, right? Depictions of two women together, depictions of two men together, either in visual depictions like this or in written depictions, any sort of depiction of two men, two women being intimate together, doing anything that might, I think, call to mind things like sexual intimacy, physical intimacy, emotional intimacy. Very often, for a long time, historians called them friends. They were close friends. I would like to know more about what potentially, if this is a mistress and a servant, what they're doing. But that's it. I'll leave that up to you. So this is a very clear example, right? In the 1980s, in the 1960s, in the 1800s, when historians were looking at this, they were like, they must just be good friends, right? In 2020, as historians, because of our cultural contexts, right, we're a lot more likely to look at this and go, oh, look, they're two women. I think they might be lovers. I want to know more about these women. I want to know more about the sort of understanding of female love in the 17th century. And potentially, right, maybe a much greater acceptance for female-female intimacy than we might think was happening in different historical periods. Just to give you two very brief examples, I'm almost done, of this phenomenon, especially with same-sex couples throughout history. Here's another description. In 1778, two Irish gentlewomen put on men's clothing and ran away together. Lady Eleanor Butler had received several offers of marriage, but was determined to share her life with her friend, Sarah Ponsonby. They spent the rest of their lives in a black and white house called Place Nuid, sorry, I don't speak Welsh, I don't know the exact pronunciation of that, outside Llangollen, cultivating their garden, improving their minds, and filling the house with clocks, cabinets, and whirligigs of every shape and hue. They also had a little dog called Sappho. If the name Sappho does not ring a bell, go Google it. It gives you another clue as to how these women are probably a little bit more than friends. And this one also, this actually comes from a friend of mine who's also a historian, and as she was working on her dissertation, she says, one of my favorite stories that never made it into my dissertation, two women physicians who graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School, lived together, traveled together, never married, and they are buried next to each other as quote unquote medical classmates, right? So this shows us, this one's a little bit more about sort of how people in the maybe the 1970s, when the second woman died, right? How maybe family members of one of these women, friends, thought what they thought was appropriate to describe these two women as. And probably for a long time, historians would look at that and go, oh yeah, classmates, of course, they would be buried next to each other. I'm very excited about being buried next to my medical classmate. Okay, so these are just some examples of, again, how changing the contemporary context of a historian can change the interpretation of a historical artifact, of a primary source. And again, we actually want that to happen. There is no such thing as a historical fact, and I don't want there ever to be a thing as a historical fact, right? Just the same way as I don't want only one person to look at the microscopic view of coronavirus and say, I've got it, I understand the truth, right? I actually want many people to look at that microscopic image and say, well, I think maybe this, I think maybe this, I think maybe this, right? That to me, that sort of collective, that sort of potentially also evolving knowledge, I think is really good for something like medicine, and it's extremely good for history. One thing I think that can produce and potentially enable is that some people view that changing, right? If history changes, then how reliable is it? And we actually see this with the medical field today, right? There are people who say things like, every time the CDC says something about coronavirus, they say something completely, right? They tell me to do something different. They're obviously not reliable. They obviously don't know what they're talking about at all if they keep changing their mind. Rather than saying, oh, look, the CDC, they keep working on this virus. They're learning new things every day. This is a good thing, right? That they're sort of increasing the amount of knowledge about this one virus. Same thing about history. I think too often there are sort of media portrayals of history as history cannot change. If people want history to change, then they somehow invalidate the history. I'm hoping to show you that we actually do want history to change. We do want different interpretations of the exact same source, different interpretations of the same event, different interpretations of the same individual. That actually gives us a much more rounder and a much more richer understanding of how people lived in the past, and also what people lived in the past, because that's one of the things we're going to talk a lot about throughout the semester, is who ends up producing primary sources or produced primary sources, and which primary sources end up being kept and then available for historians for historical research. Okay, I am going to end it. I'm just looking down. Is there anything else? No, I'm going to end it there. Okay, so you get your little 25-minute, all right, it was under 36 minutes. Come on, it's a little bit shorter this time. I'm going to end it there. So hopefully you are watching this week. If you are watching this before Thursday night, a quick reminder, don't forget to respond to your classmates' blog post before Thursday at midnight, but that's the only other thing you got to do this week. So you're watching this video, you're doing your blog post response, you're done. Take a breath. You did it. 1 week down, 15 to go. We can do it. All right, I will see you all again early next week with the next video. Continue to send me emails with any questions you have about the assignments. I'm really enjoying the course messages that I'm getting, but I'm going to talk more about that in the next video after I finish reading all the course messages. But have a wonderful weekend. Please avoid fire tornadoes, or I really think the earthworms are going to come. October, I think it's going to happen in October. All right, anyways, have a wonderful evening, and I will see you guys very soon. All right, bye.